did a lot of work last year around March. She and I did, what did we do, 5 presentations back to back, I think it was. It was kind of a crazy time. It was one every week for 5 weeks for the March Madness. So it's been a little while since I've done this. But anyway, my name is Michael Wall. I'm a consultant at 3Cloud, and ostensibly I'm a database administrator. I've been doing database work for over 20 years now. I've worked in Oracle and Ingress and lots of SQL Server. And for the last 5-6 years, I've been mostly concentrated on the Microsoft stack. But one of the things that I get to do for 3Cloud is that I get called in to do a lot of different migration tasks, because it's not just as easy as just plopping the servers up in the cloud. It often takes a lot of time and preparation and a good team to have it. And so I thought that that might be a useful discussion. You can find, I think that the recorded webinars are still out there. I've talked a lot about preparations for storage and moving to Azure and some of the gotchas. Most of those haven't changed. I mean, there's still a lot of the same limitations. So I want you to be ready with this, but these are some more specific issues that I've run into working with customers. So talking about migration. This is our agenda. We're going to cover different reasons why a company might want to migrate. There's lots of them, some good, some not so good. We're going to talk briefly about the preparation that you should probably do in order to have a good migration. Then I also want to talk about licensing. That's one of those things that I feel is a real gotcha for companies, and this is an opportunity to ideally improve your financial footprint with licensing, and also to make sure that you're completely current. And then also we'll talk about some of the different specific examples I ran into with migration and a few of the lessons learned, which will mostly come out during the migration examples. So why migrate? So I think one of the main reasons that comes to mind is that companies are looking for, it gets down to a financial reason. So maybe you're in a data center that you have to move out of. It could be that you actually have hardware that's actually dying. And also you look at the financial reasons too. I mean, and maybe it's just an excuse to force the movement of applications that haven't moved before. A lot of times companies are just waiting until they get to the migration point, and that's when they'll actually start preparing for they'll start doing the consolidation, the cleanup that they need to do. Perhaps they have 20 different apps on 20 different servers, and they realize at that point that they probably could have a footprint of about 5 different servers, and everything would run better than it did before. So consolidation can be a huge driver. One of the things that I did, application reasons too. So oftentimes, maybe you've been holding back on that key upgrade for your application due to a version upgrade. You need to have your OS upgrade, or more likely, you need to have your database backend upgraded. So it's the perfect time to do it. So it's like, okay, we're going to go ahead and get this done because we need to migrate to this version of SQL Server in order for our application to be upgraded as well. Business reasons. A lot of times, so companies are merging. You see it all the time in the news. It happens. And due to that, you have to decide, it's almost like a marriage, you have to decide if which house you're going to live in. So it could be that there's existing infrastructure, there's architecture that maybe it makes more sense to move to one data center or the other, or maybe let's just go ahead and buy a new house, quote, quote, using the marriage analogy, and let's move to the cloud. Oftentimes you'll see that you have to go through and you have to look at all the different applications, you have to look at all the different servers, and this is a time to get rid of some old stuff that maybe isn't working right and to optimize your existing footprint. Or maybe your existing data center is going away. I've started to see this in the news a little bit. Data centers are changing. You're not having so many of the monolithic data centers. I mean, as we hopefully all know, that the cloud is actually a combination of a lot of data centers still, but it's changed as far as the offerings that Microsoft has given you as far as Azure and or our other competitors. And then finally, just time. Don't believe that the cloud is cheaper. It's not. The cloud is not cheaper, but it does give you a lot of flexibility, a lot of power, And the ability, there is so much evolution that happens in Azure constantly. I mean, every month there is a change, there are changes. It's almost impossible to keep up with it. But what you do know is that Microsoft is committed to giving you those 5.9 uptime. They've got a lot of different options for you that are going to work with any sort of application. And they're also there to support you too. I mean, it's hard to ignore what the cloud is going to give you when you look at doing the migrations. But what do you need to do? So at this point, you actually have to inventory, and this is probably the hardest part of it. It's almost like going into a room and cleaning out the little piles of stuff that maybe you have sitting around. At least that's the way that my rooms are. Some people have perfectly clean houses, but the preparation time is probably the time that you need to spend the most, and the actual migration itself is relatively simple and it won't take that much time. Lots of preparation, proper preparation prevents piss poor performance, and that's the same thing here. So ideally, go through and find all of the different applications that you want to move, and then look at all the different servers that support those applications. Look at the databases that support those applications, and look at the applications. How are the users connecting to the applications? Are they using desktops? Are they going through some sort of a web portal? Do you already have a software as a solution for the application? Take time to look at the licensing agreements. It could be that there may be some limitations. Maybe you have to upgrade the license. I know one scenario we ran into where we had to contact the company that we had to contact the company, and we had to go through and do an emergency purchase of an upgraded license in order for the application to work in the new versions of SQL Server, because we went from SQL Server 2008 to SQL Server 2019, and all of a sudden things didn't work. Luckily, we were able to get hold of the vendor, and they said, "Oh, you just need to do this." We put in the new application, everything worked just fine. And then finally, inventory your application. As I stressed before, this is your opportunity to go through and clean house. Find out what you need. Find out maybe that you only one user is using this application. Maybe this is an opportunity to get rid of some older legacy applications, go to something newer. Go out and buy that new business suite that you've been eyeing for your company. So talk with your customers though. And this may be your downstream customers, but also when I say customers, I'm thinking from an IT point of view, this is going to be your users. So let them know that you really want to know all these little details. It could be that someone in accounting knows that there's an Excel spreadsheet that is key for a critical business process. You want to know all these different things because you need to make sure that those bits and pieces are brought along when you do any sort of migration. You can absolutely replicate something like that in the cloud, but you need to know, and if that part is lost, well, then your critical application will come to a screeching halt. So you want to make sure that you avoid a situation like that. And it really gets down to you're taking charge of your data estate. All too often it's easy, especially now that storage is so cheap, to not worry about some of these details. If it keeps on working, great. Hope and prayer is not a good business strategy. You have to understand what you have. You have to take charge of it because eventually things are going to break. You want to take that time. You want to go through again. You want to work with your company. You want to organize all your assets. You need to list them out and then move forward so you're ready to actually do the migration. Because when the time comes for migration, guess what? It's only probably take a couple hours and then you'll be done and everything will be working in your bright, new, shiny environment. So the other thing is working with your staff. So you can't underestimate the power of a good PM or a Scrum leader who can empower to make decisions. I recently had the pleasure of working with one of my customers, and they had an extremely good and vigilant. It was a combination of both a good PM on my side as well as a good Scrum leader on the other side, and it made all the difference. And those poor people were probably working 20 hours a day to make sure all the details were taken care of. But what the end result was is that when it came time to do the migration, which was complicated, and there were a lot of moving parts, it all just worked. We had a few little issues, but because we had spent so much time laboriously going over all the different details involved in the migration, it went fairly smoothly. But a lot of that also has to do with making sure that you know who the right people are going to be in order to make this happen. The applications don't care. They're just going to run or they're not going to run, but it's the people that are going to make all the difference. So again, those key customers that are going to be able to tell you all the weird little details about your applications, the staff that are going to know the details about your application. You want to document what you're going to do. You're going to want to have a list. And then also finally, plan out the critical dates ahead of time. So let your staff know that, hey, you're going to have to be available for this migration on these dates. Let them know in advance so that they can plan out their vacations. Now that things are loosening up a little bit in the world, people can actually go on vacations again, and they're going to go on vacations. So if you're planning to do a migration, think about what's going to be happening. Working with your providers. This is another one that can catch people. So for instance, if you're working with someone like 3Cloud, have them come in ahead of time. We'd love to know about your business. We want to know what's important to you. One of the most difficult thing I think that human beings have is when they're talking to each other is to listen what the other person says. Oftentimes people want to get their point across and they don't want to necessarily listen. And so especially in my role, one of the things that we're coming in there to do is we want to work with your business. We want to listen to see what makes your business important. And we want to understand what are the things that could make your business fail. So we need to understand how we can best partner with you and make it a good experience. But even if you're not working with 3Cloud, I mean, that's going to be the same thing when you're working with whatever your vendors are, whatever your providers are. Network. So like I said, let other key players like network. So there are a lot of, remember, when you're moving to Azure, your biggest bottleneck, your single point of failure becomes your network. So put lots of time and resources into planning ahead to make sure that you have a big pipe in order to move your data and that you have a good connection for your users to be able to connect to the applications once you're in the cloud. And then finally, go ahead and you also want to have that redundancy because as I said, your single point of failure becomes your connection to the network. So what can you do ahead of time to make sure that you have those redundant connections in place? Ideally, and I understand that it's easy for people to say that doing a baseline ahead of time is a great idea. I think everyone knows that doing a baseline ahead of time. The truth is it's hard to do a baseline for a couple different reasons. One, it's hard to get that coordination of the staff and the customers together to determine what the desired performance of the application is. It's also hard because there are variances in the cloud. You're not going to have the exact same performance characteristics in the cloud that you would be in your data center. So you have to allow for that variance, that wiggle room right there. But some of the things that you can plan on are, again, storage. I have spoken many times about storage in the cloud in Azure, and there are a lot of gotchas in storage, and it's important to understand it. And if you, I won't lie and say, I mean, the documentation out there can be a little bit daunting. It's better than it was when I first started on my quest in order to understand the storage in Azure. But it's a lot of things to think about. There are some very clever low-cost ways that you can put in place if you want to. There are also some very simple ways that cost a little bit more that will accomplish the same thing. But the main thing is that in Azure, you need to understand how the storage works and how storage can either really improve your applications or it can impact it as well. Backups, there's a whole lot of different options for backups in Azure. And we're not going to necessarily go into all of them, but the main thing is to think about, it's not even so much the backups, it's also the restore capability. So think about it. So if you're coming from a data center, it's probably fairly straightforward. You probably have a server where you maintain your backups, or maybe you have an offsite storage facility, something like that, or in the cloud facility. The point is that you knew where your backups were and you knew what your RTO, RPO were going to be in order to recover those backups. It doesn't change in Azure. It's just that you have a few different options, additional options are to do it. You could still continue to say use your existing cloud provider that's storing your backups offline. You can create another storage disk in your Azure tenant where you can store your backups. But you do want to think about how you're going to, what your backup requirements are going to be, what are your restore requirements are going to be, how are you going to access it? And it gets down to documentation. Documentation is not the most exciting thing in the world to do, but it's really, really important to document where your backups are located and how you restore them. Because if you happen to lose your critical database, your critical application, and you can't restore it, well, guess what? Your company's not working anymore. You're not making money. So you really can't spend enough time making sure that you understand how the backups for your environment are actually going to work. Understand your options in the cloud. Again, like I said, the Azure is changing literally every day, every month. There are new options coming out. There are new features coming out. In fact, I'm going to, after this presentation later on this morning, I'm planning to go to a presentation by Microsoft because I want to go catch up on a few things and see what their options are. But I think that while it may be a little bit daunting, I think the nice thing is you just have to remember that there probably is a way to do what you wanted to do ahead of time. So again, it goes back to the baseline, goes back to the assessment of what you're doing in your current environment. Look at what you need for your environment to be successful, and then look and see what your options are going to be in Azure. There probably is something that's going to replicate what you had in place ahead of time. It may cost more money, it may not. But again, this all gets down to research. This is about the planning. What are the things that you need to have and get ready for it? And then finally, software as a service, infrastructure as a service. So, I mean, a lot of the times, decisions when I'm working with customers, it gets down to whether they want to do Azure SQL or Managed SQL, or if they want to do SQL Server on a VM. I think that both options have some advantages. They both have some problems. I think that over time that some of like Azure SQL, I think has come up to speed quite a bit more. There's a lot of extra features. We're going to talk a little bit about geo replication. I still am going to personally prefer putting SQL Server on a VM because I think that I like the ability to really tune the storage because I think that the I/O on a database is really the key thing there. And you just don't have as much flexibility with Azure SQL. But Azure SQL works for a lot of different things. It's a great option. But the main thing is again, look at your applications and look at what you may need. So there are limited feature sets on Azure SQL. So it could be that your application has certain requirements that you can only get if you install SQL Server on a VM. So again, these are things that need to be reviewed, discussed with your team, with your customers, and have a list of what could be happening. And I think, let's see if I put on the next slide. I didn't put it on the next slide. One of the other things on network is, or did I do, let's see. Let me go back here. One of the things I just want to point out on network again is that the ports is one of those gotchas that I've seen happen again and again. So different applications have different port requirements. It's not just 1433, which is the default port for SQL Server. Oftentimes applications have their own TCP ports that need to be opened up. So this is one of those things where you need to go ahead and put in your network security plan for Azure and make sure that you have all those pieces in place ahead of time. So licensing. Licensing is something that there are dedicated people that work on licensing. It can be complicated, and I think that oftentimes the companies maybe accept what's given to them, but also I think I guess the point is that this is your opportunity to really work with whoever your licensing provider, and you want to see what you can do in order to improve your situation, or at least have a really solid understanding of it. You do have to have licenses in the cloud, you both OS and database. There are different options in order to save you money. For instance, there's the Azure Hybrid benefit, where you agree to pay for a couple of years in advance. You can save money that way. But you can use your existing licenses. As long as they're the right versions, you can bring them over and you can use them right there. You just pop them right into the server. One of the things that I recently learned, like in the last 6 months, is that there's a dev test, I'm not sure of the right terminology, but allocation. So essentially you can set up a dev test environment in Azure and you're signing an agreement with Microsoft and you're saying that all of these servers that have been put into here are all dev test classified, meaning that there's no customer interaction. You're not doing production work on it. You can do testing all you want. You can work with production data. You can bring it over and you can do testing on it. You just can't have that interaction with your actual customers. You can either do that, so that's just an easy way to put all of your dev test servers into one bucket and save yourself all the money on licensing. Or you can use MSDN licenses, which is another tried and true method as well. But the point is, take a look when you're doing that assessment of your data state, look at what, maybe the server could be dev test. Maybe we don't need to have as many production instances. That's where you're gonna really save a lot of money because SQL Server licenses are not cheap. But if you are so fortunate to actually pay for software assurance on top of your enterprise licenses, you can also get free licenses for your DRHA strategy. So if you have software assurance, you can get up to 18 cores for free. For it's, let's see, I believe it's, you can have 12 for HA and then another 6 for DR. And the other thing is the thing about your DRHA strategy. One of the advantages of moving to the cloud is that you literally can have any DR site in the world if you want to. Every region is accessible from every region except for a few unique ones due to government restrictions. So if you wanted to, let's say that you have your primary region in US West in the US, you could pick something like Australia if you wanted to, or Europe, or somewhere even farther away. I mean, and maybe, yeah, and maybe it's not just a DR strategy, maybe it's the HA, maybe that you want to do something with your regions because it's going to make more sense for your customers. You're going to be able to improve your latency. So again, think about what are the capabilities. It's all possible. Oh, and then also as far as Microsoft specifically, so there's the TAM, the Technical Technical Account Manager. There are very talented people that work at Microsoft who know the licensing parts inside and out, and you will have to do a little bit of homework in order to come up with it. They'll give you some tools, they can show you these different things, but believe it or not, they want to help you. They really want to come up with a good solution for you. So it can usually be worth the time to work with Microsoft and understand what is needed. So let's talk about a couple different migration scenarios. So probably the simplest one usually is you're doing on-prem to on-prem, and I've done a couple of these. Usually they're going to be in the same environment. Not always. It could be a migration from one data center to another. It could be a local data center to in the local data center. Usually in this case, you're not going to be using sort of Azure tools because there's no need to. I mean, you're not going to Azure. So the point is it gets down to usually just simple backup and recovery. But there's a lot of things that can change. Usually when you're doing this, this is because they want to do an upgrade on both the OS and the database engine. Could be an upgrade in the applications, and there could be a migration from one storage device to another. So once again, getting back, you've heard me say it multiple times already, but again, keep on hammering and plan ahead, look at what you need, look at what the desired outcome is going to be, and try to minimize the number of gotchas. Now, I am always going to prefer in this sort of situation that you have the new servers in place so that you can install the upgraded engine, the OS, and the application, so that you have everything tested and ready to go before the time comes for the actual application. Because when you actually get to the migration, all you're going to do is you're going to shut down the application on the source servers. You're going to copy the databases over in some way or another. You're going to bring them up on the new servers. You're going to change the pointers of your applications, which ideally you already had scripted out in some sort of a file ahead of time, and it's going to just work. Like I said, you spend a couple months planning for the migration, and then takes an hour and a half in order to do the actual migration itself. I am never going to recommend an in-place upgrade of an application and or database unless you really have to do it. And I don't know if you're really going to save any time in doing it. I think there's a lot of ways. I mean, even if you have things like an existing Windows failover clustering always on, that's the point of having the cluster. So you can do, there's a lot of different clever ways you can do an in-place upgrade if that's the option that you have. You can essentially check one of the nodes out of the cluster. You can do the upgrade of the OS. You can migrate things over to the new node, and then you can start going do a round robin sort of idea. So lots of ways, planning, just minimize the downtime, and that's the main thing. I mean, I don't think any customer is going to say when you ask them how long can you have for the downtime, they're always going to say as short as possible because they need to do their work. So that is your job in order to plan ahead of time to prevent any sort of downtime. So this was one that another customer assessment that I worked on, and this was definitely more challenging. This was a good case where I had to listen to what the customer wanted. And once everything was figured out that way, we came up with an interesting strategy. So it was going from on-prem data center to Azure. And I ended up using always on. That was what they wanted. And we did it, and it worked just fine. I was a little bit nervous, I have to admit, because I had to go through and set up a test environment in order to feel comfortable with it. But once I had it tested out, it worked beautifully. So I used the term that we set up the bridge. So essentially what I did was that I took the servers, so I added the new servers in Azure to the existing cluster that was in the on-prem data center. And so I built the bridge, and then we extended the AGs, and then we just waited, and you just let SQL Server do all the work for you. So the data slowly trickled across the pipe, but it did eventually catch up so that all the other replicas were in sync. And then when the time came, we just went ahead and failed over to the primary that made the replicas in Azure the primary and removed the old ones. And it was a relatively seamless downtime. It was almost no downtime. It was as simple as just shutting down the application briefly and changing the pointer because we still had a new DNS entry. But other than that, but this one is definitely one of those things where you have to worry about, again, the network ports. Like I said, you need to be prepared ahead of time, because oftentimes in the case of traditional data centers, you maybe don't have quite as tight a security because everything's all inside the same data center. Security is going to change. These are things where you have to start thinking about things like whether you want to implement Azure Active Directory, or you're going to have some sort of a hybrid approach where you're going to have both on-prem and Azure activity and access. Also, when you're migrating your servers over, this is a good time to look at your SQL security. Maybe it's time to actually review all the different accounts that have access to your databases. So in preparation for an audit, you can get rid of some of those holes that are in your security. You're also thinking about the storage again. What are your storage choices going to be? And then finally, your backups. With this specific customer, there were some issues. This is one where we ran into issues with the network. So again, this is where it takes a long time to provision bigger pipes. And so this is one of the things that you really need to plan 3 months ahead of time at least to put the work order in. Doing it at the last minute does not work very well. And that's a tough one. So, but it went well, and everyone was relatively happy. So, oh, right. And also, so on-prem to Azure, another one which was interesting. In this case, we use ASR. So that's Azure Site Recovery. And Azure Site Recovery, what it does is that it replicates the servers, and you can either use it from on-prem to Azure, or you can use it Azure to Azure. And so you create a Azure landing zone. You create a place where you're going to have the destination servers. They're in your Azure tenant, and you just start the replication process. And it takes a bit of time for them to copy over. But the main thing is that the source servers are still online. but you're copying over the servers, and they're doing snapshots to keep everything in sync. So over time, the snapshots get bigger because there's more changes, but you finally have this new footprint. And so what the time comes is that you just you click a button and you shut down the old servers, the source servers, and then you bring up the new servers. And they're going to have the same name. They just have a different name in Azure as far as the Azure object itself, but the servers will have the same name. They'll have all the same information. It's an exact copy of your server. So with this example, customer had a lot of always-on groups. They had Windows failover clusters. They had replication, and was concerned about that. But went ahead again, went back and did some testing, did some planning, did some testing to see how things worked, and it worked pretty well. So it's just a matter of shutting down the servers and bring them over, and then making all the changes to IP addresses, because that's what needed to be changed so the DNS was correct. The point is that the tool worked. It was planning and patience that really paid off at the end of the day, and there were relatively no problems once we actually got done with the migration. So Azure to Azure, and as I said, all the previous rules apply, but now you might be thinking about strategies. So it could be that maybe you wanted to set up now you're in Azure, and let's say maybe you want to set up a new DR environment, or maybe you need to move to get to a different region. One of the neat things about Azure is that there's all these different opportunities. So talking about Azure SQL, I was doing a little bit of research on this recently. So Geo Replication is pretty darn cool. And you have the two different options. So they're actually using always-on availability groups under the scenes. So you have standard Geo Replication, which allows you to you rights to replicas as many regions as you want to. So you literally could have a copy of your data in every single region in the Azure multiverse. But if you choose the premium option, you can actually have readable secondaries. And the beauty of it, even though you're only allowed four secondaries off of a primary, you can chain secondaries to secondaries. So that's how you actually could have access to every single region in Azure if you wanted to. So you literally could have a copy of your data in every single region possible. The tool is dead simple. It's just a matter of that. Let's say that you're in some region of the US and you want to fail over to your European site. You just go into the portal, you just push a button, or else you do your PowerShell script, or some other option. You just go ahead and migrate over, or switch over, fail over to that new site and go from there. But I think that this is one of the things where Azure really shines, is the idea about the DR possibilities, because it is so easy. Because once you've got your data up there, just think about just traditional using always-on groups. So let's say you're using VMs instead. Great. So go ahead and provision a server in a different region. Add that to your Windows failover cluster. Add it to your always-on availability groups. And you've got your replica right there. It's all set up. You have your networking set up, and it is so much easier than having to worry about like different scenarios. Like for instance, setting up a DR site. I know that I've literally mailed hard drives across the country to get to a DR site, or driving a couple hundred miles to get to a different area. So in Azure, it's much simpler. You have your primary tenant, and then maybe use your ASR to go ahead and copy the server over to the new region. Set up your whatever sort of software you're using for DR, set up for HA, and you're set. So again, it gets the planning. You're using the flexibility and power of Azure to your advantage, and it's going to make your company more resilient. So were there any questions at all, Crystal? Let me look for myself. Nope.
I
don't see any.
Yeah, I don't see any either. You can give maybe like a couple of minutes here for some people to come in and see if they have any questions.
Okay, well, this person left. Okay. Yeah, just the one question the person took off, so. So anyway, I guess the main thing is that there's a lot of different options. As far as, I mean, we could go at length about all the different ways you can do it. That's the one thing I've learned, is that you have to be flexible. So, you know, find out, again, listen to what your customers want, find out what the business needs, and then look at all the different tools. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Some are fairly old-fashioned, but some are ultra-modern. The main thing is that it really still just gets down to data. So you have a certain amount of data that needs to be moved to a certain place in a certain period of time. And once you rationalize it down to those points, it's a lot easier to think about it. So then you can just look at the solutions. But again, you just have to get down that essential equation: is that how much data do we need to move, where and when? And then find the right tool to do it. Listen to your customers. That's what I said about going and digging through all those nooks and crannies. You're not going to know everything. You're not expected to know everything, but you're going to have customers who are going to know about all those little oddball things. So those are the things that can break a migration. You have to find those little things that are critical to the business processes. You have to involve your customer team, make sure that they can explain how things work, and find those pieces that you need. And then finally, document everything. Again, documentation's not the most fun thing for most people. I don't, but is really critical. It's not that you have to have a document. I'm losing my voice now. It's not that you have to have a document that's current at all times, but you want to have the processes documented. So if you know that you set up these servers a certain way, make sure you document that. If you know this is how generally your backups are going to work, document that. Have that information ready. You can't keep it all in your head. That's one of those things I've learned over the years that I've worked in IT, is that you're not protecting anything by keeping that knowledge to yourself. You want to have that knowledge out there, give it out so that other people can use it, so the business can be more effective. If you're not there, nothing can, nothing, if you're not there and you took all that knowledge with you, well, then you just hurt that business. You don't want to do that. So make sure you document everything, and it's just going to make the company better. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for coming in and hosting, Michael. We greatly appreciate it. As always, you guys can find the recording to our webinars on our YouTube channel, but you guys will receive an email tomorrow around noon Eastern Standard Time with this recording in your email box. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Michael or myself. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Please feel free to follow us on social media so you guys can stay up with all of our webinars, blogs, and things. So if you guys have any questions, if not, have a wonderful day. I hope you guys have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thank you guys so much for joining. See you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.